Well, you're not the newest kid on the block forever. This Isuzu MU-X launched very recently and it's one of our favourite ute-based four-wheel drive wagons. However, there is an even newer kid on the block, and funnily enough, it's one of our other favourites in this segment as well, and that is the Ford Everest. Consider that the previous generation of this model recently won some big awards. This next generation model has some big boots to fill. It shares a lot of technology and it shares some powertrain elements with the older model, but a lot has changed. Now, these are both 7-seat SUVs, but they are proper four-wheel drives as well. They share a lot of components with their ute-based siblings. They've got low-range transfer cases, they've got locking diffs, as well as room for the family on board. So considering all of that, we're going to take these things off-road and see what they're like in comparison to each other, but also dig through the interiors, the technology, the safety, and what they're like to drive on road as well. So there's a fair bit to get through. Let's have a closer look. The Ford Everest Trend 4x4 has a starting price of $65,290 before on-road costs, and that's the most expensive variant before you get into V6 territory. The Everest range, which is an all-new model that launched late 2022, has a starting price of $52,990 for a two-wheel drive Ambiente. In four-wheel drive form, that price rises up to $57,990, once again before on-road costs. Over that base spec model, this Everest Trend picks up 18-inch alloy wheels, 7 seats instead of 5 in the Ambiente, 8-way electric driver's seat, a more premium interior treatment. There's a 12-inch infotainment display, wireless charging pad, and electric tailgate. Under the bonnet is a 2-litre twin-turbocharged diesel engine, which makes 154 kilowatts and 500 newton meters, and that runs through a 10-speed automatic gearbox with a low-range transfer case. There's a locking differential at the rear and an automatically controlled all-wheel drive system. The Isuzu MU-X is priced from $67,400 before on-road costs, but it does come with an enduring $65,990 drive-away deal, so that makes it the lowest price out of these two. And despite being a top specification model, this is technically less than a mid-spec LSU, which is priced from $61,400 before on-road costs. LST specification gets 20-inch machined finish alloy wheels, leather accented upholstery, an 8-way electric driver's seat, tyre pressure monitoring, and heated front seats. This comes on top of shared elements with lower specification models like a 9-inch infotainment display, a power tailgate, and bi-LED headlights. Common across the MU-X range is a 3-litre turbo diesel engine which makes 140 kilowatts and 450 newton meters. That runs through a 6-speed automatic gearbox and low-range transfer case. There is a locking rear differential in the 4x4 variants of the MU-X and a more basic part-time four-wheel drive system. Both of these four-wheel drive wagons have a 3.5-tonne braked towing capacity, and the Everest payload of 717 kilos is better than the MU-X at 625 kilos. But it's worth noting that neither of these vehicles can use both of their maximum towing capacity and payload at the same time. The interesting thing about this Everest Trend is that we're in a car that is mid-specification. You could even call it lower mid because there's an Ambiente below this Trend, but above there is Sport and there is also Platinum. But when you sit in this car, because we've got some options fitted, it doesn't feel like that at all. This feels fairly high spec, and especially in comparison to the MU-X, this feels higher spec than that model. And I think that's an important point because this Everest is more expensive than the MU-X, but you start to feel that value for money start to get clawed back a little bit. You've got some nice materials around the place. You've got a big infotainment display that's got all the bells and whistles. There's a digital instrument cluster as well. But in terms of practicality, it feels really good. You've got some storage down here. There's a wireless charging pad, heaps of power outlets, and these seats, it is optional in this Trend specification, but they're comfortable. They've got a leather-like material on the outside and electric adjustment. Ergonomically, practicality-wise, this interior, I have to be honest with you, doesn't really put much of a foot wrong. Here's the second row of the Everest. That's my driving position up front there, so I'll talk about legroom. It is really good in this Everest. It's fairly spacious, and I've got good headroom as well. You'll notice there's a bit of a scallop there to help with that headroom. I've got an air vent up there, and there is also a fan speed control element down there on the back of this center console, along with some power outlets. So this is pretty well sorted. Let's pop that headrest up there. Comfort-wise, visibility-wise, this is good. And you've got the added benefit in this Everest of having sliding seat base and the adjustment as well of the backrest. So you can dial yourself in a little bit more comfortably, especially if you've got people in the third row, which I will get to now. Here's the third row of the Everest, and let's be honest, it's not too bad. I've got this seat positioned here in front for someone who's got enough leg room, but they have slid that second row forward to give me a bit of space. And it's a little bit tight. This is never going to be as good as something like a Sorrento, a Kluger, let alone a Kia Carnival or a People Mover. But for the purpose, it's okay. I've got a little bit of headroom here. Once again, this is scalloped down the sides and I've got some air vents there. I like the visibility from here. You can see a bit of what's going on. You can see out the window, and you do have a little bit of comfort with things like cup holders and that sort of thing. So, you know, if you're a big adult, a fairly large human, you'll find it tight, but most people would be able to live in here for a fair while, I think. Here's the boot of the Everest in 7-seat mode. And as you can see, there's a little bit of space you can use there. You could do your grocery run and that sort of thing. Probably not take the kids away on holiday with all the bags and all the rest, but let me just pop these down. It's the lever, it's not the strap, by the way. And there you go, that is the Everest in 5-seat mode, and that is fairly spacious. The seats fold mostly flat, but not completely flat, but I do like the trick that we've got here. This thing here, that is a bit of extra space. You can store some other bits and bobs under there, but you can also pop this thing up, click these things into place, and you've got a luggage divider, which I think is really handy. You can put things like groceries in there and they're not going to slide around as much as they would normally. It's a really smart little idea. Here's the interior of the Isuzu MU-X, and this is top spec LST specification, so you do get everything in this car. You've got nice electric seats. They've got pretty good adjustment going on. That is electric adjustment, by the way, and you get the larger infotainment display. It's not as big as the Everest, and it doesn't have as many features in terms of wireless connectivity and the fancy operating system, but when it's all said and done, it's not too bad of a system. You do get some extra cup holders and an extra glove box like you do in the Everest, but the finish is maybe a little bit more basic in this MU-X. Don't forget, this is a little bit cheaper, so you can kind of see where that cost difference comes from a little bit. Ergonomically speaking, practically speaking, this is very fit for purpose. It's comfortable to drive, it's comfortable to sit in, and you've got spots for your drinks and a pretty good sized center console and all that sort of thing. It's good enough, probably not as good as the Everest, however. Here's the second row of the MU-X, and first things to report is legroom is pretty good. This does not have a sliding seat base like the Everest does. It is fixed. Instead, this one does tumble forward, which I'll show you in a minute. But at least where it's positioned normally, there is good legroom on offer in this second row. Headroom is good as well. I've got air vents up here like the Everest, but the air speed control, the fan speed control I should say, is mounted up in the roof there. There's 2 USB points behind the center console and a small storage bin for, well, something not terribly huge, I suppose you could say. But otherwise, general comfort and that sort of thing, this MU-X is good. It's got good space. It probably doesn't feel as wide as the Everest, but overall it's solid. Here's the third row of the MU-X, and this seat can't slide forward and back, so it's in its set position, but thankfully legroom is pretty decent. There's a little bit of toe room there, and overall space in terms of the lower limbs is about on par with the Everest where I had it earlier, so it is pretty good. Comfort-wise, this seems okay as well. My headroom is starting to run out slightly when I lean back my head here, right there. Just because that drops down a little bit, I'm rubbing my head a bit. But there are air vents here. You don't have any fan speed controls in the back here. Neither do you in the Everest, by the way, but you've got cup holders, pretty good visibility, and windows as well, which are a little bit smaller than the Everest. But I would say for a 7-seat four-wheel drive, this is quite solid as well. About line ball, I would say. So here's the boot of the MU-X in 7-seat mode, and it's not a huge boot, yes, but I think for everyday usage, before you go on things like road trips, that is enough space for things like groceries, picking the kids up from school, and all of that sort of thing. You do have a little bit of additional space under here for maybe a few bits and bobs. There is a power outlet there, 12 volt, and an additional light. But if you need more room, you have to pop down this, and that is the amount of space you've got in 5-seat mode. That feels a little bit bigger maybe than the Everest, and it does seem to fold slightly flatter as well, although you can't slide that second row forward to make even more space if you did want. But overall, pretty solid. The Ford Everest has long been one of the nicer four-wheel drive wagons in its segment. And that's been for many years now, since that first generation model came out in around 2015. This new model just takes that to the next level a little bit more. It's got a nice ride, it steers nicely, it feels really well sorted with that final bit of polish overall, especially when you compare it to the Isuzu MU-X. Ride quality is nice. I think in this trend specification, the 18-inch wheels do help just to soak up some of those lumps and bumps. But the combination of steering, ride and handling all feels really nice. This 2-litre bi-turbo engine, it's one of the smaller engines in the segment, but it does get away with feeling like a little bit more of a muscular experience because of those two turbochargers. And it's matched to a 10-speed automatic gearbox, which is carryover, but it has been updated with a new torque converter, and it does make a difference to the driving experience in a better way. It feels a little bit more connected. It doesn't shift around as much as it used to. It feels a bit more direct, although it still feels a little bit busy, especially in comparison to that Isuzu. The way the engine revs, the way the gears change and that sort of thing, it does jump around a little bit. It's mostly masked, but it's not as smooth or as relaxed outright as the Isuzu. It is, however, quite refined and quiet in here. And while this Ford does have more torque on paper than the Isuzu, once you start punching it a little bit harder up hills, or if you're towing, for example, something like that, you can feel that the torque is available in a narrower band of revs. So that puts a little bit more onus on the gearbox to shift around to find where that power and torque is. And that's one of the major reasons why the Isuzu feels a little bit more relaxed. It can hold its gears a little bit longer. It's got less to choose from, but it's got more torque around the complete rev range as well, which does benefit the driving experience. This Isuzu MU-X is relatively very new in the segment, but it doesn't take long for a new competitor to come along. And this MU-X does start to feel its age in comparison to that Ford Everest surprisingly quickly. There's a few things that make this feel a little bit more truck-like, I suppose, and that's not always a bad thing, but it's definitely not as refined or as polished as the Everest. Some things I do like, however, this powertrain, 3-litre, single turbo, it doesn't have as much outright torque as the Everest's smaller engine, but I have to say, it feels like it's got more torque in more places overall. The engine feels a bit lazy, but in a good way. It's relaxed and it gets along, and it doesn't seem to feel too stressed. It's matched really nicely to this 6-speed automatic gearbox. It doesn't have 10 speeds, but it doesn't need 10 speeds either. This gearbox is really nice and smooth. It makes great decisions, and you don't really feel like you need anything more. And because we're in a top spec LST MU-X, we've got 20-inch wheels, and they probably do disrupt the ride quality a little bit. You'd probably get a better ride in a lower specification model, but still the ride quality is good. It's fairly soft, a little bit wafting at times, but it can get a little bit wobbly as well. It's probably a bit more truck-like, I suppose, or a bit more four-wheel drive-esque in comparison to the Everest. And of course, we've only got part-time four-wheel drive in this MU-X, so we don't have the ability to do forward-driven wheels on the road. You'll notice that more in slippery situations and conditions. This is a more basic, definitely a fairly proven system over the years. Four-wheel drives have been using part-time setups just like this one for a very long time now. It's simple and it works. It's definitely not as sophisticated as the Everest, and you don't get that benefit of having extra grip in slippery conditions. Although this Ford Everest is an all-new platform, it is a close evolution of the model that came before it. There is independent front suspension, and that is matched to a live rear axle, which uses a relatively uncommon Watts linkage control arm setup. The engine and gearbox are carried over from the previous generation as well, but have been tweaked and modified for improved performance in this new model. The Isuzu MU-X uses a relatively new 3-litre iteration of the company's well-regarded 4J series of diesel engines, and like the Everest, it uses a setup that is new but closely related to the previous generation model. It also has independent suspension up front, along with a live rear axle controlled by a panhard rod. One major difference between the Everest and the MU-X is the four-wheel drive system. The Isuzu uses a well-known and time-honoured part-time four-wheel drive system. It's shift on the fly with a simple and effective dog clutch mechanism that locks the front and rear wheels together. But this means you cannot use forward-driven wheels on the blacktop. Instead, it's rear-wheel drive only. The Ford Everest uses a much more sophisticated and complex all-wheel drive system, which uses electronically controlled clutch packs to connect the front and rear wheels together. Now, this can be locked into a proper 50-50 split for off-roading, but can also vary the split through controlled clutch slippage. Off-road, it's a close call between these two wagons. On one hand, the 18-inch wheels of the Everest are much better suited to the dirt and rocks in comparison to the 20s on this top-spec MU-X. And having a locking rear differential as standard fitment means both of these four-wheel drive wagons will likely take on more than most owners will need. However, the Isuzu does manage to score points back with a well-tuned rough terrain mode that seemed to be more effective than the Ford's choice of driving modes. The Isuzu also seems to have slightly more articulation on offer, and that's thanks most likely to that rear panhard rod suspension setup. The Ford Everest hasn't been around for that long, but you've got to say this car already has very strong pedigree in Australia. We know that the Ranger is good, we know that the Ranger Raptor is good, and well, this Ford Everest is very good as well. And in this comparison, it does win because it is better in a lot of respects in comparison to that MU-X. But I've got to say, this Isuzu, it goes down really fighting, mostly on the value point of view. I really like the powertrain in this thing. I do enjoy that lazy torque that 3-litre engine gives, and being significantly cheaper than this Everest as tested, this definitely has credit for looking at. But if you do want the best in tech, you want the best in comfort, you want a little bit more adaptability in the interior, then this Ford Everest is well worth consideration. I've got to say, this comparison was a lot closer in the end than I originally thought it would be. And let me know in the comments below, do you think I got it right? Do you think the Everest is a pick, or would you prefer this Isuzu MU-X? Let me know in the comments, give me a thumbs up while you're there, and make sure you subscribe to Drive on YouTube. And of course, if you want to read the full comparison between these two and just about anything else you want to know about cars in Australia, go to Drive.com.au.